Over the last couple of years, we've been having some really awesome video game adaptations like The Last of Us, Fallout, and Arcane. Long gone are the days of the terrible video game adaptations of the 1993 Super Mario Bros. Or even Doom. Actually, wait, hold up. Okay, well, maybe not every single video game adaptation has been a great success, but I feel like we've been getting far more hits than misses. It also seems like a lot more games are getting picked up into adaptations as well. For example, there's the God of War TV series and also the Ghost of Tsushima and Bioshock movies that have also been announced. But we are starting to see smaller titles get picked up too. One upcoming adaptation that has me quite excited is Pacific Drive. If you haven't heard of it, it's a car roguelike that was developed by Ironwood Studios and only released early last year. The story itself takes place in the early 1990s, and you play as an unnamed character that explores this area called the Olympic Exclusion Zone, which is just a really creepy place set in the Pacific Northwest. It's definitely a unique game in recent memory, and it's because of the atmosphere and tone. I find it really unique compared to other games and super immersive. So there's a couple things like when you get out of the car, you have to manually pull the handbrake, and all of the UI in the game is in the world, meaning that you actually have to look at the car's dashboard to check all your different vital signs and make sure that nothing is damaged. And whenever you leave the garage, you have to plan your trips very carefully and bring the according resources. Now, in December of last year, Atomic Monster acquired the rights to develop Pacific Drive as a TV series with James Wan at the helm. James Wan, of course, being the director who did films like Saw, The Conjuring, and Insidious. Now, I'm super curious to see how this even gets adapted into something much more passive like a TV show, and in this video, I want to kind of look at the history of video game adaptations, why they were notoriously horrible for the first half, and why I think we might be entering a golden age. Although there were a handful of game adaptations that came out before the critically panned Super Mario Bros. In 1993, the title remains as one of the worst examples of a video game adaptation, even making several lists of one of the worst films ever made. Reviews at the time criticized the film for not having much connected to the source material, terrible writing, and whatever the hell this is. Bruh. So video game adaptations certainly didn't make a good first impression on audiences, and from the late 1990s to early 2000s, game adaptations kind of had a reputation for being movies that were pretty ass. Although you did have a couple of exceptions like Paul W.S. Anderson's Mortal Kombat, which released in 1995 and was actually a pretty big commercial success, most other films in this genre were not highly praised at all. During this time, we had a bevy of terrible films like Doom, Silent Hill, Max Payne, or basically every single Uwe Boll game adaptation. So why were game adaptations so terrible? In truth, I don't think it's because of any one factor, but kind of a bevy of reasons. I posted a poll on my community page asking what makes a good or bad adaptation, and the number one reason was, unsurprisingly, how the source material is handled. Now, of course, this is the largest number one reason, but there are a couple of others I'd like to get into as well. Adaptations in general have a tall task ahead of them from their inception. Because the original source material already has a fan base, adaptations have to both appease us and appeal to general audiences who have never heard of the IP being adapted before. When the people in charge of making these films don't really understand what makes it special or fail at translating it from either the big or small screen, we're kind of ultimately left with something that's not really for anybody. Unlike the structured plot of literature or comic books, I also feel like video games were much harder to adapt because of their interactivity. We're being taken out of something interactive and being placed in a passive medium. We're no longer an active participant of the story, we're just seeing it unfold on screen, and that comes with its unique set of challenges to overcome. That kind of being coupled with other things that make a terrible movie like cringe acting or horrible CGI, and you can kind of see why we were left in the dark ages for so long. I mean, all you have to do is scroll on Wikipedia and look at all these Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic scores to see why game adaptations had the reputation they did. However, in recent years, we've had a string of decent releases from Detective Pikachu to Gran Turismo that were actually both critical and commercial successes. And although the newest Mortal Kombat film didn't do gangbusters at the box office and wasn't super highly praised, I actually found it pretty decent and a far cry from what we had before. And then, all of a sudden, we were blessed with the holy trinity of game adaptations. They are, of course, The Last of Us, Fallout, and Arcane. I honestly feel like a lot of the success of these shows made people realize, like, wait a minute, We can do game adaptations not just well, but actually have them be critically acclaimed. And it's all the stuff that does what a good adaptation is meant to do, and that's obviously appease both the existing fans and bring new people in to see the IP. Now, this trend with Arcane, Fallout, and The Last of Us also kind of suggests that game adaptations do much better at TV shows, and I generally think this is because we have longer time for the episodes and characters to breathe, as well as the plot to unfold. And also, mind you, in the early 2000s, we didn't really have the Game of Throneses or the Walking Deads to kind of change the way we even view television, having bigger budgets and things like that. So I definitely think this was not possible in the early days. And even 20 years later, 2023's Super Mario Bros. Film completely dominated at the box office, becoming the highest grossing film based on a video game, and was received well by critics and fans alike, which is kind of on the complete opposite end of its 1993 counterpart. Something I also find really interesting is that the adaptations that tend to do really well have some form of the original creative team behind them, whether that's the writers or the artists or people just involved in the making of those games too. I also think like nowadays, studios are more willing to put in the time and effort to make these really, really good because of all of the string of failures before it. Do you remember when Sonic was announced and then we had his original design? The outcry was so massive that they completely changed the design to be more faithful, and now we're 3 movies deep. This definitely wouldn't have been possible if they kept to the original design and it flopped super hard, so I'm glad that they're actually listening too. So we can see that the success does happen when you appease the right people that want to support the film. Something I do want to chat about is the different styles of adaptations and how they contrast, specifically The Last of Us and Fallout. Now, both of them are set in a post-apocalypse, but they're very, very different in execution. One of them is a cinematic story-driven game and the other is an RPG. In Fallout, we're not really getting an adaptation of a storyline that's happened, but instead we're following a group of characters within the actual game world. So Lucy, Howard, and Maximus are all original characters for the series, and we don't have any preconceived notions of them beforehand. We're kind of learning about them as we're watching the show. But all of the events of the games have occurred, and this has been referenced multiple times throughout the series. In The Last of Us, we already know the story of Joel and Ellie, and although it's not a complete one-to-one adaptation, it still follows all of the same story beats and moments. So on the one hand, you have an adaptation that's doing something completely new in the universe, and you have another one that's following what's already been done before. In Fallout's case, it works extremely well because the world itself exists beyond any specific character. Since Fallout is an RPG, it's much more about the weird creatures and factions and locations and quests than anything else. And that's why our main 3 characters all contrast so heavily, because the writers wanted to use them as an entryway, as kind of different POVs within the world. In The Last of Us's case, the story is really about the relationship between Joel and Ellie instead of the world itself. Sure, I mean, the cordyceps virus is a pretty unique take on the zombie apocalypse genre, but the heart of the story really lies with Joel and Ellie and kind of their bond as they progress throughout the story. So kind of all in all, we can see that neither way is wrong or right as long as the spirit and tone are correct. I think obviously if an adaptation is too similar to the source material, then I wonder why it's even being made in the first place. But if it's far too different, then it kind of feels like a cash grab. And also, just bringing back Mario for a second, there's a funny skit on SNL that basically parodies Mario in the world of The Last of Us. I'm going to link it down in the description below, but the whole point of the skit being to show the kind of dichotomy between game adaptations, so one being super dark and post-apocalyptic, and then you have that contrasting with the really bright colors of Mario. Now, whether intentional or not, I also think this skit is a commentary on the state of game adaptations being taken more seriously by mainstream audiences, but also the kinds of stories that are going to do well. Now, one show that I find that kind of exists as the best of both adaptations is Arcane, in the sense that it has pre-existing lore and characters, but the show itself exists as a unique story. Since League is a MOBA, I wouldn't consider it a story-driven game by any means, especially since the moment-to-moment gameplay is more about the objectives of the match and dealing with your teammates. Now, because I listen to my friends, I've never actually played League before, and so Arcane was kind of my first introduction to the series, but I do find it cool that they've taken the existing characters and made a show around them. And the coolest part is, the game itself has kind of been slowly changing by adding new skins and champions as Arcane continues to evolve. Now, to continue that thought, an interesting case study in how adaptations can also influence the original game itself is the case of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. When Cyberpunk 2077 was released back in 2020, it was received super poorly because of how broken it was and all of the different bugs and lack of features. Now, over time, the game did get a couple of updates here and there, but I definitely wanted to stay away from it as far as possible, or at least until everything was fixed. I'm sure I don't need to remind you, but it was really disappointing to see how the game is received, especially after all of that hype. Then, 2 years later, Cyberpunk Edgerunners comes out and serves as a prequel to Cyberpunk's story and debuted on Netflix to over 14.88 million viewers in its first week. The show itself was slick and extremely well done, but interestingly enough, the studio behind the show didn't expect it to become a massive success. As showrunner Rafal Jackie told Hollywood Reporter in 2023, "I need to find something I enjoy that feels like my own. If it's like that, others will love it too." They didn't set out with a specific target audience in mind, but the success of the show helped to rehabilitate Cyberpunk's image and reputation and brought more people to play the game. In this case, and like Fallout and Arcane, you have a show that exists within the game's world, but it's not a direct adaptation of an existing story. Coupled with the amazing talent from Trigger, and you're left with something that actually helped the original game flourish. And now, much like the futuristic world of Cyberpunk, let's take our attention to where video game adaptations could go in the future. When Secret Level was announced early last year, I was so excited at the idea of an anthology series about games. The teaser trailer showed Jinsakai, Kratos, and Sifu, and I was already sold. But since it's come out, it's honestly kind of a mixed bag. Some of my favorites are, of course, Sifu's short, but I also really enjoyed the Eternum one with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I found it very, very wholesome. But the Warhammer one was obviously incredible. And my favorite out of the entire bunch, though, was the Unreal Tournament with Zan. That all of them were just so satisfying to watch, and they kind of had that through story that you could follow from start to finish. I have seen a bunch of discourse online about people referring to Secret Level as feeling like kind of an ad, which I can agree with a little bit. But it's interesting though, because in Cyberpunk's case, Edgerunners existed as something outside of the game, but because it was received so well, the original game started to flourish. I think the ad criticism in Secret Level definitely stems from the episodes feeling way too short and not really pushing anything forward apart from just being attached to an IP. Us gamers have been getting some damn good cinematic trailers over the years, and a couple that come to mind are things like the original BioShock trailer, or the ones, I don't remember the name of the Star Wars game, but it was like a MMORPG, and they had really long 10-minute cinematics, which looked absolutely incredible. And who could forget DC Universe Online as well? That entire thing with all of the heroes interacting, peak, so good. The difference was, though, with these shorts is that we knew that they were tied directly to a game, and we'd often see these trailers pop up at like E3 or on YouTube or something else, and not in the case of Secret Level. And I definitely think in Secret Level's case, people were just wanting something with a little bit more to sink their teeth into. I know that Love, Death and Robots had episodes with a similar kind of runtime, so it's not entirely the runtime's fault, but LDR wasn't really connected to anything. They weren't connected to video games. And as such, we didn't have preconceived expectations or notions about them. Now, I get that Secret Level was probably shorter because of things like budget constraints, as well as just the amount of time that the studios had, but the ad criticism still kind of holds up. Also, the last episode of Secret Level was really disappointing and forgettable. It didn't really feel like a celebration of PlayStation games or characters, and it was kind of just more using their popularity to drive the plot forward. I don't really mind a mashup like Ready Player One, but if you're using Kratos and Jin Sakai in your trailer, and then for them to show up as like 2-second cameos in the actual episode, very disappointing, that's all I'm gonna say. If you've seen Secret Level, I'd love to know your thoughts about where it could go, especially since it got picked up for season 2. What kind of games do you think they're gonna do next, and what kind of shorts do you hope to see in the future? Personally, I wanna see more game adaptations go the Sifu route, and I'm of course really biased to this kind of graphic, painterly aesthetic. It's all I talk about on the channel, but when you retain the game's original art style and play into the strengths of animation and go full forward, oof, it's real good. Now, can you imagine something like a Dishonored series or something set in the world of Limbo? Or, like whatever disgusting slop we had last year with Borderlands? Imagine if they actually retained the art style and made it animation instead. That would be amazing. Other adaptations I think could be really, really awesome are, my friend and I, Sol, talked about this a couple of times, and we've both pitched the idea of a Halo TV series set around ODSTs, but in the style of Band of Brothers. Like something like that could be incredible. I also think that the upcoming BioShock, whatever it ends up being, it would be so cool, again, if it wasn't the direct adaptation of the story, but more about the world of Rapture itself. Kind of having like noir mysteries and detectives, a little bit like Burial at Sea, but again from the point of view of different characters. Basically, all I'm saying is just make Fallout BioShock. That's all I want. And then of course you have the entire horror game genre, and I know we've had a couple of adaptations of Silent Hill and Resident Evil, but a couple of newer titles too could be really, really amazing. Games such as Fatal Frame or Subnautica, or even like the original Amnesia series are all kind of rife for exploration, which could be really awesome. There was that Markiplier Iron Lung adaptation that was supposed to be coming out too, but I'm not actually sure what's happening with that anymore, and it seems like the project has gone quiet. If game adaptations keep trending this way too, I definitely think we're going to be seeing a lot of successes in the future. Something I've also seen online is people saying that because we all have superhero fatigue right now, that, video game adaptations are going to be like the next big thing, which I honestly have no idea, but it's just an interesting thought nonetheless. So that's kind of my thoughts surrounding the state of the industry and where things could go in the future. I also think that a big reason that video game adaptations are doing much better now is we just honestly have richer stories to work with. Most game plots in the early 2000s were kind of bare bones, a lot of it was just about the gameplay as well. But as games start to continue pushing that envelope and telling richer stories, we're going to be seeing better adaptations as a result of it too. Before I end off the video, I want to leave you all with 2 questions, and that's, do you ever see a world where video game adaptations start to replace comic book films? And what games do you want to see be adapted well? Thank you for watching this one, everyone. I appreciate you sticking around until the end, and until next time, take care and stay safe.